Go. Afternoon, everybody. We're just going to give it a couple of minutes to let the people join the session, and then I'll do the introductions. So I hope you're all well. There's a few people joining now, so we'll give it another minute or so to let them all in, and then we'll get cracking on. Okay. Well, my name is Doug McGill. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the organising official for Bectu, covering Scotland and the north east of England. But on top of the normal day-to-day duties, I've been asked to pull together and coordinate some advice for people on health and safety, and in particular returning to work. So as theatres and cinemas and art centres start to open up, then we've launched a couple of webinars to give people some more information and to explain how to go about creating your own risk assessments. To that end, we've got a guest speaker, presenter, Jonathan Green from Prospect. He works in the research department there. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Jonathan and we'll get started.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Well, what I'm going to do is give you a presentation which will aim to help you negotiate a safe return to work. So in this presentation, it'll take roughly 30 minutes, and it will cover health and safety law and practice, the framework for managing risk, and some information about what that looks like in relation to COVID-19. So Doug, if you can put the slides up and we'll begin. Just say while Doug's doing that, if you have any questions, if you can put those in the Q&A box down the bottom, and when I finish the presentation, we'll try and get through as many of those questions as possible. So if we can go to the first slide. To the next slide.
Okay.
Okay, it's all working smoothly. Okay, so I'll begin. So as you can see here on this slide, it gives you a summary of the main points of the Health and Safety at Work Act. This underpins the health and safety legal framework. So it contains what are called general duties that apply to a range of actors at work. These are known as duty holders, and the main duty holder is the employer. So the Health and Safety at Work Act, it's called an enabling act as it enables the creation of further regulations, and I'll talk a bit about some of the relevant ones in a minute. And these provide more detail about the very wide general duties. So as you can see there, the general duty, it shall be the duty of every employer to ensure, so as far as is reasonably practicable, the health, safety and welfare at work of all his employees. And I'll come back to that phrase reasonably practicable quite a lot in the presentation. So there are similar provisions in the Act that cover people who are not employees, contractors, temps, freelancers and members of the public and so on. And it contains more specific foundational duties about safe systems and so on, and importantly around consultation on health and safety matters. So if we can go to the next slide. So the general duty contains the requirement for employers to take steps to reduce, so far as is reasonably practicable. This is the concept which is at the heart of the British health and safety system. And it's phrased in this way so that the regulations can be applied flexibly so that it's relevant to all working environments. And using that particular formulation of reasonably practicable, it recognises that risk can't always be removed. Sometimes it can, but often it needs to be managed or reduced as far as possible. So this requires the duty holder to make a calculation or judgment, weighing up the risk against the sacrifice involved in removing or reducing that risk, whether that be money, time, or trouble. So specifically, a proposed control measure must be implemented if the sacrifice or costs are not grossly disproportionate to the benefits achieved by introducing the measure. So you can see immediately anything which involves weighing up, discussion, some sort of assessment or judgment, there are going to be different views about what might be reasonably practicable. So that's why employers must consult employees when they introduce control measures to control hazards at work. Employers don't have all the answers, and workers will have very good insights into how to do their jobs safely. So it's why it's enshrined within health and safety law that there should be consultation with the workforce. So the aim of those consultations is to try and reach a satisfactory arrangement. I'll come on to talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. So the principles of health and safety consultation. In this slide, it specifically talks about the Safety Representatives and Safety Committee Regulations 1977. These regulations, they came a little time after the Health and Safety at Work Act was introduced. It's the cornerstone, really, of the consultation framework where unions are involved in discussions around health and safety. Regulation 4A requires employers to consult with health and safety representatives in good time. And good time is not defined within the regulations. However, the Brown Book, which is the guidance booklet for these regulations, states it means before making decisions involving work equipment, processes, or organisation, which could have health and safety consequences for employees. You should allow time to provide health and safety representatives with information about what you propose to do, give them an opportunity to express their views about the matter in the light of that information, and then take account of any response. So this gives a clear obligation on the employer to consult with the workforce before measures are introduced. And that's particularly important in terms of COVID-19 and the arrangements that employers put in place as they reopen workplaces, offices, and so on and so forth. So if we go on to the next slide. So the process of identifying hazards and weighing up the risks that I spoke about earlier is called a risk assessment. So this is covered by another set of regulations called the Management of Health and Safety at Work Regulations. So this is a systematic process of establishing what can cause people harm at work and the steps that are needed to prevent that harm from occurring. And these are often called control measures. So I'll speak a bit more about control measures in relation to COVID in a minute. So a bit more on risk assessment first. It's not a document, it's a process of thinking about risk and how to control it. But in most workplaces where we're involved, there will be a documented risk assessment, and I'll give some examples of that in a sec. So the regulations require the risk assessments are suitable and sufficient. According to the HSE, that means that a proper check was made, all the things that could cause people harm were identified, the employer asked who might be affected, all the significant risks that were dealt with, significant meaning more than minimal, taking into account the number of people who could be affected, and that the precautions are reasonable and that the remaining risk is as low as reasonably practicable, and that workers or their representatives were involved in the process. So if we can go to the next slide, please, Doug. On the HSE website, you'll find, if you look at risk assessment, there's this handy guide of that process. It breaks it down into a simple 5-step process, and that just goes over the same ground I just mentioned. So identify the hazards, decide who might be harmed and how, evaluate the risks and decide on precautions, record the findings and implement them, and review the assessment and update if necessary. And importantly, at the bottom, communicate those findings to all who could be affected, particularly if it's a shared site. If you're looking for guidance on health and safety law in general and the regulations, the HSE website has a lot of resources that are very easy to follow, and this is one of them. As I said in the previous slides, there's a lot of language there which is very open-ended. And I think what that means in terms of the union is there are opportunities for us to discuss with employers and challenge. So if we go on to the next slide. So in these next couple of slides, I'll talk about the way risk assessments can be presented. There's no one set formula used, and you'll see some models on the HSE website if you go there. So one way of approaching a risk assessment is to produce what's called a risk rating to evaluate the risks in the workplace. So as you can see, with likelihood down one side and severity along the top, a risk rating is a product of the likelihood of an adverse event multiplied by the severity or consequence of exposure to the identified hazard. So this can be used as a guide to risk assessors in an evaluation of risks of an activity or task. So if we go to the next slide, we'll see how this works in practice. The risk rating system was used in this particular form of risk assessment. So as you can see, hopefully along the top, the headings. So it identifies the operational tasks. So in this case, reception area and stairs and lift. Talks about the hazard, and this is particularly in relation to COVID-19. So the risk of infection to staff and visitors. And then it gives a risk rating. So severity, if you remember, was along the top, and it's saying severity is 5, which means the most severe. And that's appropriate with COVID-19 because we know that some people who catch it unfortunately die. Likelihood is an assessment of how likely it would be to happen in these particular areas. So reception area, this is a place where people are moving through relatively quickly. So that's why it's a 3. The risk is still high though, because of level 3 is considered not to be an acceptable level of likelihood. So then reading on to the next columns, it talks about the existing control measures in place. So there are already some measures shown, so the principles of physical distancing, which people will have heard about, the 2 meters distance between people. But it's felt that there was further action required. So to help people judge the 2-metre distance, floor markings indicating 2-metre distance, introducing a one-way system, and modifying how people enter the building. And so as a result of this, the residual risk, the likelihood has moved down from 3 to 2, and the risk is 3. So you can see here the purpose of a risk assessment is to methodically think about the hazard, think about the control measures that could be put in place with the aim of reducing the likelihood of the hazard to have harm on people. So that essentially is what a risk assessment is about. So if we go on to the next slide, this shows another example. This is more straightforward. The same things apply in this particular risk assessment. So again, on the left-hand side, it identifies the hazards, the middle column, potential risks to workers caused by the hazards, and then the final column is control measures. We don't have the complicated numbers in here. It doesn't really matter. The important thing, the important point for health and safety representatives is they give an opportunity to discuss with the employer the control measures and what's appropriate in the workplace. So in our representative role, unions are the check and balance, if you like, on behalf of the workforce. So the questions we need to ask is, can the risk be reduced further? Is the remaining risk as low as it is reasonably practicable, using the phrase from the Health and Safety at Work Act? Are there any other controls available that are higher up the hierarchy of control? And I'll explain what that means in a second. And do the control measures break the chain of transmission, the mechanism in this place of how COVID is passed from one person to another? So I'll say a bit more about those things now. So next slide, please, Doug. So some methods of controlling risk are more effective than others. And the union approach is always to encourage employers to prioritise the most effective methods over the least effective, and give priorities to measures which protect everyone over measures which only protect individuals. So we want measures which, regardless of who the people are, everyone is going to be included, rather than focusing on the individual. So this methodology is known as the hierarchy of control. The measures are shown as a pyramid because the ones towards the top are generally seen to be more effective to those going down the pyramid. The top 3 in this list talk about creating a safe place. So elimination is removing the hazard altogether. In some cases, you can replace a hazardous material with a non-hazardous one. That's clearly not the case in COVID. We can't replace, unfortunately, we can't replace COVID with something else. So that's not really relevant to us. Engineering controls are things that we put in place to physically stop the transmission. So those are the top 3. And then we come on to other changes lower down the hierarchy, administrative controls. So this is things like procedures, written procedures, or advice that may be offered. And so this is relying on changing people's behaviours and changing the workplace through guiding people into safer ways of working. And obviously, this is less effective because it relies on people complying with those administrative controls. But even with all these controls in place, in some cases, it will be necessary to have personal protective equipment. And this, the reason why this is at the bottom of the pyramid of control is this is focused on the individual rather than being applicable to everyone. So usually with the hierarchy of control, there'll be a need to use different elements, either engineering controls, admin controls, possibly PPE, we use everything to try and make the workplace safe and in an appropriate way. So we don't necessarily use them all. We look at the tasks and we think about what's needed, but it might need a combination of methods. Okay, next slide. So I spoke about the chain of infection, and this is a useful way of thinking about COVID-19 and how we might control risks. So people will probably be familiar with how COVID-19 is transmitted. So the source is respiratory droplets from a person who has the virus. The transmission is the airborne transfer of the virus from people with COVID-19 and contact with surfaces carrying the infection. And so we know that COVID stays on surfaces, depending on the surface, for some time. And then it reaches the host. Those droplets enter the body through the mucous membranes, either the mouth, the nose, or possibly the eyes. So the aim of our control measures is to break this chain of infection. So if we can break the chain of infection, then it controls the risk of transmitting COVID. So if you think back to the previous slide, hierarchy of control, elimination is the most effective means. So if we can remove people from transmitting to other people altogether, then that's obviously the most effective. And then we go down the, for example, using engineering controls, if we can stop droplets being passed to another person. So if you think of supermarkets and screens, there's a good example of an engineering method used to control the transmission. But the central aim here is what we're trying to do is introduce control measures that break that chain of infection. So next slide. So as I said earlier, remove the risk wherever possible. So that will include where people have symptoms at work that they're asked to isolate at home, ensuring people work from home where they can. This may not always be possible. People have to do their job in the office or at work, and particularly in relation to people in this call, working from home won't be relevant for many of your jobs. Providing hand washing facilities and hand sanitizers, that again reduces the risk of passing on the virus. Providing information helps people in terms of understanding the risk and hopefully persuading people to comply with the measures that have been introduced. So all of these things can be done, but by and of themselves, they're not the only measures that will be successful. So if we can go to the next slide. People will have heard the discussion about social distancing or physical distancing, if we're going to be a bit more accurate. So this is about the need to have a gap of up to 2 meters between people. And this is because we know that coronavirus spreads through the transmission of droplets. So the further people are away from each other, the less likely those droplets will be transferred from one person to another. And so for that reason, the union recommends that we stick with the 2 meter gap where possible. The government in England has changed their guidance to 1 meter plus, and that's partly because of their assessment of the transmission within the community at large. But in terms of workplaces, what the union is recommending is that we stick to 2 meters distance, because in our view, that is the more distance there is between people, as I said before, then it lowers that risk. We can talk about examples of how you might do that in terms of managing the workplace. And I think certainly when you're thinking about your own workplaces, you'll have your own ideas in terms of how to create that 2 meters distance. And that's certainly an area where the union would want to be discussing with employers how to create 2 meters distance where possible. So physically segregating people. So as I said previously, one-way systems. It might also mean lowering the number of people in the workplace at any one time. So staggering shifts, that kind of thing, where you've got workstations, making sure that there's sufficient gap between them. Things like hot desking that basically the government actually says this, that it recommends that hot desking should not be used if at all possible, and that's because of the risk of COVID being on surfaces, and other things like erecting barriers. So if we can go to the next slide. I spoke a bit about personal protective equipment. So this, if you remember, this was at the bottom of the hierarchy of control. And I think it's important to think about where PPE might be necessary. So it should only be needed where the nature of the task dictates that the 2 meter separation cannot be maintained and there are no alternative ways of carrying out the task. And the reason for that last bit is because there are risks associated with PPE. So the government guidance at the moment doesn't recommend that employees should wear PPE during close quarters working, other than in healthcare settings or to protect against other risks that are more typically associated with the task, for example, protection against dust or chemicals. So we've seen some change in the guidance over the last few months, so face coverings on transport and in shops. So certainly the issue around face coverings in enclosed spaces would be something that I'm sure would be an item for discussion, and maybe this is something that people may want to ask a question about, and either myself or Doug can give a response on that. So it's important to say this is an area where our guidance differs from the government's guidance. So wearing PPE where the risk can't be controlled, in our view, is consistent with the approach of reducing risk to the lowest reasonably practicable level. And the importance of saying that is if you think it's appropriate, then it's something you'll need to discuss with your employer and get their agreement. And I think you can mount some arguments if it is appropriate to the task, that it would be appropriate. So in these circumstances, the union recommends that fluid-resistant surgical face masks are used. These are known as type IR or type IIR face masks. And again, you can find more details on the HSE website. There's other forms of protection, respiratory protective equipment that provides a higher level of protection, such as disposable half mask respirators classed as either FFP2 or FFP3. So you would need to look at what the appropriate form of mask, where it was needed, what the appropriate form of mask was for the task. And so the type of tasks that you would be looking and thinking about, this is something where we need to discuss with the employer, those where there's going to be a longer duration, close contact, and masks needed to provide that higher level of protection. And as I said, the reason why PPE is at the bottom of the hierarchy of control, and it's important to stress this, is that it actually introduces risks as well if it's not used correctly. So if it is introduced, people need to be properly trained, make sure it's disposed of safely, and that it's compatible with any other PPE being worn. So if it's tight-fitting respirators, it will need a face fit test to ensure it's safe. Okay, next slide. So I've spoken a bit about the general approach in terms of consultation, but it's worth talking about disputes over safety that might involve individuals as well. So the Employment Rights Act does give some protections to individuals. So it's unlawful to subject an employee to a detriment or to dismiss them where they take appropriate steps to protect themselves or others in circumstances where they reasonably believe they are facing a serious and imminent danger which cannot reasonably be avoided. So that's section 44 of the Employment Rights Act. So it's important to sound some caution over how this particular protection can be used. So it can only be enforced in an employment tribunal after an individual has faced some kind of detriment or dismissal. So immediately it's something that happens after the event, not during the event. So it's something that you can discuss. I think this is unsafe, and you can signal that to the employer. But if you're dismissed, then you'll have to make your case in a tribunal that the circumstances were indeed unsafe. So the union will use the law robustly to defend our members, and we do that every day. But it should be noted that the tribunal will consider all the circumstances in a case. For example, whether the employee's belief was reasonable, the extent of the danger, whether it could be avoided, and the extent to which the employer was following official guidance. And remember, in relation to PPE, for example, this is not included in government guidance. So where our guidance conflicts with government guidance, potentially this could be an issue where if agreement can't be reached between the employer and the people at work, there could be disputes which could result in people on the wrong side of a discussion with the employer suffering a detriment such as dismissal. The important thing is, if you're in that situation, what we recommend is you talk to a full-time union official about the right course of action. And the best possible approach is to try a collective approach to try and resolve an issue. Okay, next slide. So in this slide, we discuss the approach to risk assessment for different protected groups, and in particular, as you can see, for BAME workers. Just this week, we've heard reports of more investigation into the impact of COVID-19 on Black and ethnic minority workers. So there's been a lot of discussion about how best to approach this in different workforce groups. So we caution against an approach that suggests that the individual and their personal characteristics are the hazard. The risk assessment should target risks and not people. So there's a danger that categorizing and attributing risk purely by statistical means will fail to address any underlying causes of risk. So we don't properly understand why COVID is impacting people in particular ways. There's a lot of evidence, and certainly the TEC has spoken about this, that socioeconomic factors are particularly important when it comes to Black and ethnic minority workers. So what we would expect an employer to do is to consult the whole workforce and to hold them to account for fair and equal application of their risk management process. So we would expect, for example, looking at jobs where, say, Black members are more likely to be working, and whether they're more at risk because of the type of tasks they do, whether they're working longer shifts and so on. Similarly, women may be more likely to be impacted by ill-fitting PPE. We know that from our own research. Whether young workers are more likely to be pressured into working in unsafe conditions. So there are some grounds for challenging employers' behaviour through different measures through the Equality Act. Okay, next slide. So this one talks about transport. People will have heard a lot of discussion again in terms of the use of public transport in particular. So employers will need to consider how their workforce gets to work and the steps that will be needed to reduce the risks of transmission wherever possible. So as I said previously, ensuring that people who can work from home continue to do so, but that's not possible in all cases. So it might be looking at car parking spaces, cycling, encouraging walking to work and making sure there's facilities available to do this. Where possible, to stagger shifts, help people by avoiding the busiest routes. I think this is something which, again, when thinking about return to work, it is one of the anxieties people have where there's no alternatives but using public transport. Raising with the employer how people will approach it if they don't feel safe, and ensuring that people aren't penalised because of that. So just the last slide, and then we'll move into questions. On the website, you'll find resources which talk a bit more about the kind of advice and guidance and specific issues that people have raised in a number of areas. So if you have a question, you may find the answer there. As I said previously, the HSE website is a good resource, and also the government website itself does offer guidance as well, and it's worth looking at that just in terms of seeing how your employer is using that guidance and that they're following all the options available. But with that, I think it's the right time to go into questions.
Okay, thanks very much, Jonathan. That's a good question. Do they need to consult with casual or zero-hour contract workers? Well, the answer to that is yes, they need to consult with all workers who are involved in the processes that they're doing the risk assessment for. So everybody who works there should be consulted and get their agreement.
Yeah, I should add, I spoke about the 77 regs. We may have some people on the call in non-recognised workplaces. There's a different set of regulations for consultation, but Doug's quite right. The employer does need to consult with everyone, and also needs to take into account people who don't directly work for them as well, and find a way of talking to those people as well. It gets more complicated with agency workers, so I won't go there, but I mean, basically, even in non-recognised workplaces, the employer should be consulting with all the workers. The 77 regs give unions more say in terms of the measures that are introduced by employers.
Okay, thank you. Now the question here, Picture Houses is asking customers to wear masks in foyer areas. However, they're saying customers can remove masks within the auditorium. Does that fit in with the health and safety and government guidance? I believe, Jonathan might be correct me, but I believe the government's position on this is changing for indoor places. That it might be that everybody has to wear a mask throughout the performance. That's not clear yet that it's actually going to be introduced, but it looks like the government are moving in that direction. Do you agree, Jonathan?
It certainly looks that way in terms of the way the advice went with shops, where it was optional to people using masks. And the important thing to say about masks is they offer protection to other people. They don't necessarily help the wearer of the mask, but it's like the collective responsibility of everyone. So you're reducing the risk, you're reducing passing on the infection to others by wearing a mask. So it's a social good, if you like. Certainly in terms of auditoriums, it would seem a sensible thing to do, and it's a minor inconvenience in terms of having something brilliant like live theatre or cinema, having that minor inconvenience of wearing a mask. And I think hopefully we will begin to open up, and it might mean introducing things like that. And certainly I think in the union, from the union's point of view, I think it's something that we would put forward as a suggestion to employers, and probably employers would in most cases agree.
Okay, there's a supplementary to that one as well, Jonathan. Apparently they've designed a booking system where two separate groups can book in behind one another, but the rest of the screen can be empty. I presume that's the rest of the auditorium's empty. They told us the row in front or behind is 1.2 metres away. And again, that's that 1 metre plus rule in England, which doesn't apply in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, which is 2 metres. So the member's asking what the policy for sitting with somebody you don't know for 2 hours at that distance should be.
Yeah, if we're in less than 2 meters distance from someone, then the risk is higher. There's lots of guidance actually on the government website in relation, for example, to office and control centres about how you reduce risk. So, for example, having people face to face is more risky than having people behind you. So, for example, if there was a rows gap between people, you would be more or less 2 meters distance from someone, and the risk would be less because you're not face to face with someone. Having said that, and somebody may well raise this question, we certainly got it yesterday. It depends on other factors as well, such as air circulation within the auditorium. So ventilation systems, and the important point there is if there's a way of circulating air, so there's fresh air coming into an area, then that reduces the risk further. So it's very much about context. All of this is about context and reducing the levels of risk. So outside is safer than inside. That will always be true. But even the way people are sat within an auditorium can reduce that risk. And this is something which I know is we've heard is being discussed. What is the acceptable level in terms of achieving social distancing and still being able to make money in terms of the maximum size? So there's no clear answer in terms of the evidence, but what we would say is the more we can achieve a 2 meters distance, the safer it is. And I think in terms of reassuring the public to come through the door and pay money, they would need to know that the place is safe. And so that can only be done really if there is, certainly in our view, in the union's view, a 2 meter distance.
Okay, there's been a couple of questions about the slides being available. Yes, they can be. If anybody wants a set of the slides, if they drop me an email, dmcgill@bectu.org.uk, I'll pass them on to you. There's a question here, would you agree that freelancers are more likely to be at risk of accepting roles with inadequate protections? I think practically speaking that probably is the case, because by the nature of the precarious work that freelancers do and the hand-to-mouth existence, it tends to be moving from one contract to another. Then the temptation to take any work that's available at this moment in time must be huge. But we would counsel all our members, particularly freelancers, to be very, very careful in, in being tempted to accept some of these contracts if the safeguards are not adequate or not properly in place, because it's your health that's potentially affected and those of your family and your nearest and dearest. So watch out, be careful. What we would like to do is anybody who knows of dodgy contracts, as we're referring to them, or bad practices, is to notify your full-time official. And if needs be, we will write to the employers as well to point out that they need to take more stringent measures.
And I think I'd like to add to that as well. If you look at health and safety law doesn't give total coverage to self-employed people or freelancers. It does put some of that responsibility and risk on the individual. That's certainly true. But health and safety law does give you some rights as well in terms of discussing with employers, knowing what the situation is. So if a situation does feel unsafe, then it's something that you can press the employer on. I think probably COVID-19 is a slightly different situation from some other health and safety situations where the risks will involve everyone at work. So those control measures that need to be in place need to protect everyone at work. So I think certainly the union would be looking at that more as a collective issue involving everyone at work. So I'm sure you're right that the risks are greater for freelancers, but at the same time, I think this is one issue where it's possible to push back a bit harder than maybe we would on some other issues.
Okay, to what extent can employees require staff to clean public toilets in public spaces?
I mean, there's two things to say there. Firstly, it depends on if that is your job. It's a cleaning task. So if that is part of your normal duties, then obviously that would be something you would do. But the employer needs to properly risk assess that. So this is one area where some PPE would be needed. So gloves certainly, possibly a mask. So the employer should look at that sensibly in terms of the risk involved, because there clearly are risks cleaning public toilets and the frequency of cleaning public toilets. So if the question is because some employers are asking people to do things which are not normally their tasks, because there's a need to clean toilets more frequently, then that's certainly something which the union would need to discuss with employers. So it might be necessary for the employer to employ more cleaners. And I think that's certainly something where the union would want to push back quite hard in terms of saying people don't just pick up tasks just because they certainly are. Those tasks need to be done and need to be done more frequently. But in terms of how that's done and who does that task, that's a discussion which would normally be had with the employer.
Yes, and just to emphasise that obviously the regulations and the guidance are leaning very heavily on hygiene and sanitation, cleaning on a regular basis. So it's not something that should just be handed willy-nilly out to somebody because they happen to be on the payroll. It's something that the employers have to seriously consider doing it, and doing it to the proper standard as well, to protect the workers and members of the public as well. So it's really important that they do it correctly.
And I think, I mean, that is certainly, if that is going on in workplaces, I think that's the sort of issue which Bectu would be very interested in hearing more about examples of where employers are taking that sort of approach with their workers. And we would be pressing quite hard on those sorts of issues and asking some serious questions about the approach of the employer.
Yeah, and also taking that kind of thing to the press, because name and shame can be a very powerful weapon for the union to use. There's one here about shift patterns. I'll take this up, Jonathan. Work 3 days in and 2 days out on furlough. Yeah, that's what's called flexible furlough. So your employee can consider doing that, and so you would get your furlough money for the days you weren't working, and you would get your normal pay for the days that you are working. But bearing in mind the furlough scheme is coming to a gradual close, then that might not be a long-term solution for the issue, but at the moment it's certainly available. Okay, sartorial question. Can your employer specify that face masks should be a certain colour in line with uniform standards? Well, I think the answer to that is the employer should be supplying the masks in the first place for you. So if they want them to be a particular colour to match the rest of your uniform, then that's what they should be supplying.
Yeah, it's a great. I really like that question. I mean, I think in terms of face masks, we know, as I said earlier, any sort, according to the government guidance, any sort of face mask or face covering will be appropriate if it's needed. I think if we're talking about the workplace, Doug's quite right. We're talking about something slightly different. If we're talking about face masks being needed in relation to the task, then I think the responsibility does fall on the employer. So if they want to have a branded form of face mask, then that would be up to them.
Okay. Now there's a question here about disputes. How would you recommend members who are not likely to be experts on risk and transmission of viruses judge serious and imminent danger? And what do you think is believed to be reasonable?
Reasonable is a horrible word, isn't it? I mean, this is why we really caution in terms of how the Section 44 regulations are used. I would always say talk to a union rep. If you feel you're unsafe, explain what's going on, and people will have different levels of anxiety. It won't be the same for everyone. In terms of feeling unsafe, that will depend on people's personal circumstance. So, for example, if somebody has a health condition, if they're shielding someone, they may be feeling very differently about the risks and whether they're safe at work compared to someone else in the workforce. So, in terms of reasonableness, those are the sort of things where you would want to deal with an employer directly to talk about those anxieties and concerns. If you don't get an appropriate answer and still feel really concerned that you're exposing yourself to risk when you shouldn't be, and it might be your route to work. As I said, public transport can be really variable. I think that is the point where you really do need to be talking to the union, because it's much more difficult for the union to resolve things afterwards. If we can get involved before situations escalate, then maybe we'll be able to help you resolve those situations. But I think the important thing is to speak up. If you have concerns, speak up, let your employer know. That's the first point where you're talking about reasonableness. You need to be reassured by your employer that as far as you're concerned, your concerns about safety have been properly addressed. So speak up. We would strongly encourage you to do that.
Okay, and that answer would apply to the question about an employer who's already gone back to business and opened without consulting staff. You need to raise your concerns. You need to ask to see the risk assessment so you can assess if yourself see if it's adequate. If you have any concerns about it, then come back to your full-time official, your local rep if you have one. But that's the kind of bad practice that Jonathan touched on earlier that we want to know about, and we want to be in a position to name and shame If you have a problem with your employer refusing to hand over information like that, come back to us and we'll write to them on your behalf in the first instance. I mean, a lot of our employers, a lot of our members on this session don't have recognition agreements and stuff, but it's not to say that you can't be represented as an individual because you are a member of the trade union.
And you'll rarely hear me praise the government, the Tory government, but it's one thing they've been very clear about in their guidance is that the workforce should be consulted, and that's for a very simple reason. That the risk from COVID-19 is real, and so going back to work is a real risk for people, which is why employers need to consult their workforce. So if they have introduced measures and not included workers in that consultation, because as I said in the presentation, you'll have a view about how to do your job safely, so they should be talking to you.
Yeah. Okay, one last question, I believe. Can I ask my employer to get my overdue holidays and furlough as my workplace are reducing the staff as low business? It kind of depends who your employer is and how they're applying the furlough to that one. Some employers are specifying that workers should go on holiday. Others are saying that they don't accrue holiday while they're on furlough as well. So we've got a few questions that we're discussing with the legal team. So if I could ask that member to email me separately at dmcgill@bectu.org.uk, I'll pick up the conversation and we'll discuss what your options are and how we can move that one forward. Thank you. And the last one is thank you, that was really helpful. So I think on that positive note, because we are under a bit of time pressure for the next session, I'd like to thank Jonathan for his wonderful presentation. Thanks very much. I'd like to thank you guys all for attending, and stay safe, stay well, and remember the union's here for you. Don't be shy to pick up the phone or drop an email if you want further advice or information. That's what we're here for, to support our members. So thanks a lot and enjoy the rest of the afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks everyone. Thank you. Bye.
Cheers now.